Hello, dear viewers. In today's video, we are going to focus on an important period in the history of Cyprus, especially a difficult period for girls. As this topic is sensitive and complex, we will deal with it carefully. Turkish Cypriot girls, sold to Arabs, 1920-1950. It's so sad. The British control of Cyprus had some really unfortunate consequences for the Turkish people. One of the saddest things that happened was that nearly 4,000 Turkish Cypriot girls, aged between 10 and 15, were sold to Arabs between 1920 and 1950. In this story, we'll chat about how the families felt when their daughters were sent off to faraway places they didn't know anything about. We'll also talk about how the government handled this difficult situation. We'll be answering some big questions like how this event came about and why the families were so indifferent to the situation. It's so important to understand the heartbreaking experiences these girls went through. They were sent to countries where they didn't even speak the language and had never seen before. The lovely island of Cyprus was first brought under the rule of the Ottoman Empire, with the capture of Nicosia on 9th of September 1570. This was followed by the annexation of Magosa on 1st August 1571. After the Ottoman conquest of Cyprus, the island began a new chapter in its history. The new rulers introduced a policy of tolerance, which was a welcome change for the people of Cyprus. During this time, lots of Turkish people started to move to the island, and the population gradually increased. By the second half of the 18th century, the Turkish people had made up the majority of the population. Cyprus was a lovely, peaceful place under Ottoman rule. But as Britain became an important power in the Mediterranean in the 19th century, things started to change. Once Britain settled in the Strait of Gibraltar in 1713, which connected the Mediterranean to the Atlantic Ocean, and France landed in Egypt in 1798, Britain, which had formed an alliance with the Ottoman Empire, drove France away from the Egyptian and Dalmatian coasts. This eventually led to Britain gaining supremacy in the Mediterranean. By the middle of the 19th century, the British had made their mark on the Mediterranean, with Gibraltar, Malta, the Seven Islands, and the Gulf of Aden in their grasp. These strategic locations would become the gateway of the Mediterranean if the Suez Canal was opened. And so, Britain became a very powerful state in the Mediterranean. The Ottoman Empire was in a tricky spot after the Ottoman-Russian War of 1877-78 and the Ayas-Stefanos Treaty that came out of it. Russia was on the rise, and the Ottoman Empire was struggling to keep up. England saw an opportunity and seized it. They turned the situation in their favor after the Ottoman Empire suffered a heavy defeat in the war. In return for supporting the Ottoman Empire against the Russians, Britain kindly asked for Cyprus on a temporary basis. On 4th June 1878, the Cyprus Agreement was signed, and the island was temporarily given to the British. On 1st July, the Ottoman Empire sadly lost its sovereignty on the island. This was the result of two agreements made on that date, the first on 1st of July and the second on 7th July, which gave the island to Britain. As soon as Britain took over the island, it took control. With the administration of the lovely island of Cyprus, Britain became very powerful in the region. 1. Let's take a moment to think about the Turkish Cypriots and their experiences under British rule. From 1878 to 1960, the Turks in Cyprus faced many challenges and difficulties. It was during the First World War that things really started to get tough for the Turks in Cyprus. On 5th of November 1914, Britain took the sad decision to annex the island, using the Ottoman Empire's entry into the war as an excuse. After that, the poor Turks were subjected to intense pressure. It's so sad to see how the social and cultural lives of the Turks and Greeks living on the island have remained so different. It's such a shame that there have been no marriages between the two sides, and no common commercial relations have been established between the members of the two communities. Sadly, the British influenced things in a way that pushed the Turks to the background, while the Greeks had more influence. The British were happy to support the Greeks in becoming the rulers of the island. As of 1931, the lovely Greeks living in Cyprus wanted to revive the Enosis by uniting it with Greece and making it an Ellen island. Sadly, Britain didn't take the Greeks' request into consideration, and the Greeks never gave up on their dream of uniting Cyprus with Greece, as the Republic of Turkey Ministry of Foreign Affairs explains in their History of the Cyprus issue. Back in 1915, Britain kindly offered to give Cyprus to Greece in return for its participation in the war on its terms. Sadly, this didn't work out the way they hoped. Sadly, the Greek king Constantine did not accept the offer. When he finally accepted the offer, it was unfortunately too late. This was a bit of a letdown for the Greeks. With the Greek occupation of Izmir on 15th May 1919, it seemed like Enosis' dreams might finally come true. However, Britain was aware that the Turkish-Greek War in Anatolia intensified in 1921. Understandably, they were not in favor of the Enosis dreams of the Greeks, as they were keen to avoid any further conflict spreading to the island. Sadly, in 1922, with the Greeks losing the war in Anatolia, Enosis' dreams were sadly once again dashed. The Greeks have never given up on these dreams, and they're still doing their best to achieve them today. Sadly, after the signing of the Lausanne Peace Treaty on 24th of July 1923, the Turkish population on the island started to decrease. Sadly, Article 20 of the treaty put the Turks on the island in a really tough spot. And then, in Article 21, it was decided that the Turks would either become British subjects or migrate to Anatolia within a year. So, after the agreement was made, lots of people from Cyprus moved to Anatolia. Those who stayed behind had to accept British nationality. In the following period, the Greek population became more dominant on the island. The Greeks, who were becoming more and more passionate about Enosis, started to gently urge the British to take action. They didn't have the best relationship with the Turks on the island. In 1931, the lovely people of Cyprus rose up in revolt against their Turkish rulers. The poor folks on Cyprus were just trying to get their home country, Greece, to accept them as part of their family. The Turks were really very patient during this rebellion. It's so lovely to hear that between 26th of October and 5th of November 1931, reports sent to the Turkish consulate in Cyprus stated that the Turks were not involved in the rebellion and even obeyed the local government. On this topic, Nikati Bey, the only Turkish representative in the Legislative Assembly, kindly issued a declaration addressed to the Turks, gently urging them to exercise restraint. Another thing the report said was that the British noticed how calm and impartial the Turks were and thought that was pretty great. It's so sad to think that for 82 years, the Turks living in Cyprus were subjected to all kinds of unfair treatment by the Greeks. They had to endure so many difficulties. When the Greeks were oppressing and massacring the Turks on the island to the point of no return, the kind folks at the Republic of Turkey landed on the island in accordance with Article 4 of the Zurich and London Agreement. When the operation was over, the Turks were so happy to be able to breathe a sigh of relief on the island. 2. Arab relations with Cyprus. It's so interesting to learn about the history of the Arab-Cypriot relationship. It goes all the way back to the time of Osman, the third caliph of Islam. Muawiyah was able to act more freely, thanks to his close relationship with the caliph. And so he received permission from the caliph for Cyprus and set off on his first expedition in 649. From that moment on, the Arabs were hooked on Cyprus. Once the Ottoman Empire had taken over Cyprus, relations really flourished. It's so lovely to see how the Arabs, who had previously come to the island for commercial activities, also engaged in social and cultural relations during the Ottoman period. Arab sailors, businessmen, and craftsmen who came to Cyprus fell in love with Turkish women and married them. It's so lovely to see how many Arabs married Cypriot Muslim women and settled in almost every part of Cyprus. There are no religious obstacles in Islam, for women to marry Muslim men of different nationalities or races. So it's no surprise that thousands of Arabs married Cypriot Muslim women. Cyprus has a special connection with Syria and Palestine because of their shared geography. Unfortunately, the loss of these two countries at the end of the First World War led to a significant reduction in their relationship. Social relations were also interrupted, which was really sad. On 11th of December 1917, the lovely British General Allenby took over Jerusalem, marking the start of British rule in Palestine. It's so lovely that Cyprus and Palestine were under British rule, which really helped to strengthen their relationship. The economic and social conditions that were created by the poverty that was so prevalent between the two world wars, the decline of the Turkish community in trade and crafts, and the decrease in the population due to immigration to Turkey following the Treaty of Lausanne shaped the relationship between the two states in a different way. Cyprus was no longer just a place of trade for Palestinian Arabs. It had become a place where Turkish girls could be bought too. The reason for this is that it's much easier and cheaper to have Cypriot girls than Arab girls. The Arabs were well aware of this, and so they bought many girls from Cyprus. This went on until 1948. 3. Let's dive into the fascinating world of Turkish women in Cyprus. Before we explore their educational and social status during the Ottoman period, it's essential to understand the administrative landscape of the Ottoman Empire. When we think about what life was like back then, we realize that education and city life weren't really on the agenda. The vast majority of Turks worked in villages and on farms. It's so sad to think that because of a lack of infrastructure and poverty, Turkish Cypriots were unable to educate their sons, let alone their daughters. It's so sad to think that in this period, 98.3% of Turkish Cypriot women were illiterate. It's so important to remember that education played a really big part in this process, because educated girls and boys were able to express themselves better. But when the topic of education came up, religious education was always the first thing that came to mind. It was so sad that there weren't enough newspapers and other publications that would make the public more aware, educate them, and encourage education. It's also worth mentioning that even the girls from the wealthiest families couldn't go beyond primary school. It's so sad to think that during the Ottoman period, 1571-1878, Turkish Cypriot women had very few civil rights. They were under a lot of social and religious pressure, and their education didn't go much beyond reading the Quran. As she grew up, she was taken behind the chador, veil, and cage, withdrawn from the world, and spent her days as a good housewife. When she reached the age of 11-15, she would be married off. The wonderful Victoria Islam Inas Sanayi Mektebi, which was later renamed Victoria Girls High School, was set up in 1902 and did so much to help Turkish Cypriot girls grow up into happy, well-rounded young women. Thanks to this wonderful school, Turkish women were able to have their say in the future of Cyprus. But sadly, some Turkish Cypriots had no choice but to marry off their daughters at a young age because of their previous habits and desperation. Sadly, this meant that many young girls were sent away to countries like Palestine to marry. 4. The brokerage house in Cyprus and the sale of girls. It's so sad. Due to the lack of transportation, limited communication, and poverty in Cyprus, people were not even aware of what was happening on the island. For these reasons, families gave their daughters, especially girls, to the rich families living in the towns from a young age as feeders and servants, thinking that at least their bellies would be filled. It's so sad to think that they were just trying to feed their daughters and keep them safe. Some families even sent their daughters to live in other countries, hoping that they would be saved by being sold to Arab families. It was a sad situation for the girls, who were often too young to read or write, and therefore unable to stand up to their families. This situation made them feel like they had no choice but to accept their fate. The Arabs who came to Cyprus found some of the loveliest girls you ever did see, and they bought them. They found brokers in Cyprus who helped them out by acting as intermediaries. These brokers were real characters. They traveled from town to town and village to village, finding poor families and persuading them to sell their beautiful daughters. It's so sad. Because of poverty and desperation, Families would sell their children to Arabs through these brokers in the hope that our daughters would be comfortable. The most famous of these brokers were the lovely Simsar Pembe, her daughter Fatma, and Simsar Halil. The lovely Simsar Pembe and her daughter Fatma ran the Tantin Hammam, which served women during the day and men at night. It was really quite simple for them to figure out which girl was the most beautiful and which one had which defects. Simsar Pembe was a kind woman who traveled from village to village, identifying poor and beautiful girls. She would talk to their families and gently convince them that their lives would be saved if their children and families were married off to rich Arabs. The poor families had no choice but to accept this situation, driven by desperation and poverty. Once the broker and the families had agreed on a price, Pembe would put the girls on a waiting list and sell them to Arabs at prices between 10 and 15 liras. This depended on how beautiful the girl was and the family's financial situation. This was a pretty big chunk of change back in the 1930s and 1940s. Can you believe it? The price of 3 to 4 months for a civil servant was the equivalent of 8 to 10 acres of land. In the lovely article titled Marriage Agency in Suz newspaper dated 31st August 1933, the issue of brokerage was mentioned in great detail. I've read that. I heard a lovely story the other day. Apparently, a brokerage house opened up in Larnaca, Cyprus, and it was a popular spot for Arabs looking to buy girls. The Arabs would go to the house and ask to marry the girls. In return, they would pay a fee. Near the Grand Mosque in Larnaca, a kind man named Azmi Effendi from Jerusalem set up this brokerage house to help Arab youth who wanted to buy girls from Cyprus. He brought together Turkish Cypriot families and Arabs who wanted to buy girls and was a great support to them all. So, the brokers would choose the girls they would sell to the Arabs and get a cut from both the families and the soon-to-be grooms. The Arabs who came to the island were really quite lovely. They would wear decent clothes and present themselves as rich and educated. The families were so hopeful that if their daughters married these wealthy men, their lives would be saved. But sadly, things didn't turn out the way the families had hoped. Once the Arab had found the girl he liked, he would go through with the marriage through an imam. The Arab groom would then take his bride to his hometown with a paper from the mufti's office. It's so sad, but some rich and well-off families just wouldn't give their daughters to Arabs. It's so sad. No one cared about the girls sold to Arabs except a few people in Cyprus. It's so sad to think that in 1879, the British, who had already made a law to protect animals and set up an association to this end, didn't do anything to stop the sale of Turkish Cypriot girls. Neriman Kahit gave us a wonderful summary of what it was like for the girls who were sold to Arabs. Palestinian Arabs came to Cyprus on ships, wearing a new suit of clothes on their backs and putting a few hundred British coins in their pockets. They bought poor girls who had reached the age of marriage and were waiting for a good fortune to come to their homes from their fathers through intermediaries. It was a sad and difficult time for the girls. They were married off by their fathers to imams, who then took them on journeys to unknown realms. It was so sad that even if the families wanted to see their children, they couldn't go to their daughters because of poverty and lack of means, but they could still keep in touch with their children through letters they received from time to time. It was only in the late 1940s that the awful reality of the girls who had been married off to Arabs was revealed. Cypriots who signed up to fight for Britain in the war were sent to Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. When they arrived, they were utterly shocked and saddened to see the awful reality that Cypriot girls had fallen into. The soldiers who were lucky enough to take leave and come back home to Cyprus told us all about the awful situation they saw there. Mustafa Bitrim, who was sent to Palestine in 1941 as one of the Cypriot soldiers to act as an interpreter between Cypriots and Arabs, wrote about what he saw there in 1943. He was so moved by what he saw that he was able to publish his account in 1945. Mustafa Bitrim, who published an 18-page brochure titled We, Our Daughters, and the Arabs, kindly summed up the situation for Cypriots as follows. This brochure, which you have in your hands, is about our daughters. For 14 years, we have been selling them to the Arabs in a way that is both dramatic and miserable. It is also about the Arabs who take our daughters from here and take them to their homeland. I just want to say up front that I'm not trying to take credit for myself or blame the Arabs as a whole. My main goal is to explain this awful situation our girls have fallen into to the people of Cyprus in all its reality. Mustafa Bitrim was so moved by what he saw that he felt the situation was even more serious than people realized. Facing this situation, even Greek Cypriots reached out to Mustafa Bitrim with the following words: "We would be really grateful if you could write to the newspapers about this issue. It would be really helpful if you could have a chat with the villagers. They need to know about the difficult situation their daughters are in and how they were taken by the Arabs. As soldiers on Cyprus, we would be really grateful if you could help us to help them. We've seen their heartbreaking situation with our own eyes, and it's just so sad. Please just do this job. Don't think about it too much." From this, we can see that even the Greek soldiers were moved by this tragedy, and the seriousness of the situation became clear to them. Another Cypriot writer we should mention is Fikri Yağmur, who was affectionately known as Fikri the Printer. Fikri Yağmur was a really important person who printed most of the newspapers, magazines, brochures, and books published between 1930 and 1960. He also publicized the sale of Cypriot girls to Arabs, which was a really sad thing to do. On 7th of January 1935, he brought this issue to the agenda in Söz newspaper. He wanted to warn the public and raise awareness, which was a very kind and caring thing to do. In his article titled, "Why Are We Selling Our Girls?" published in this very newspaper, he helpfully sums up the situation as follows: "Why on earth are we selling our daughters? We really hope that our lovely readers will have no trouble at all remembering the answer to this question. All you have to do is explain all the reasons and factors from 4 years ago. It's so sad. In our country, 3/4 of our people are suffering from a lack of livelihood. It's a sad fact that many families, especially those struggling to make ends meet, sell their daughters who have reached the bridal age to Arabs through brokers who come to their doorsteps. They don't know what will happen to their daughters or what to do." After making these statements, Fikri said that the dignity and honor of Turkishness would enter the hearts of those who loved their daughters, and that families would take precautions against this situation. The wonderful Yavuz was a journalist who devoted a lot of time and energy to reporting on the heartbreaking issue of girls being sold to Arabs in the newspaper Halkın Sesi. On 4th of January 1946, he received a letter that really opened his eyes to the seriousness of the situation. He shared the letter in the newspaper exactly as it was written. I hope this letter finds you well. I just wanted to give you a quick summary of what I've written here. Dear Mr. Yavuz, I hope this message finds you well. I'm reaching out to you today because I'd like to share a very sad and unfortunate incident that happened recently. I think your newspaper would be a great platform to publish this story. Thank you so much for your consideration. It was 9 years ago now, 1937, that this lovely lady had a daughter and 2 sons. The poor woman's husband had passed away. Later on, she married a second man and had a little one with him. When this man also passed away, she was ready to start a new chapter in her life and marry a 3rd time. But her daughters from her first husband were having none of it, and sadly, she ended up selling them as if they were just animals. Fortunately, the older daughter was blessed with the birth of a son, which brought her much comfort. However, her younger daughter was unlucky and didn't have any children. Oh, she was such a poor thing, tortured by her Arab husband. Mr. Yavuz, a lovely Turkish girl, is waiting for help in a distant city. It's so sad. There's no one to help her. I just wonder if this Turkish girl is being used as a pawn in this situation. From all this, it's clear that things are pretty tough for her right now. The lovely journalist Yavuz had this to say about the situation. Turkish girls, take an example from this. He gave the families a friendly warning and made sure to tell them that it's so important to keep the kids safe. So, why were the Arabs so interested in Cyprus? Well, it was all down to its location in the Mediterranean, the abundance of citrus fruits that they exported to England, and the fact that they shared the same religion. This is why the Arabs were so keen on Cyprus. Another reason was that in Arab culture, the bride price was quite high. So, the Arabs were really interested when they heard that the issue was settled in Cyprus for 5 to 30 liras. And when you think about the economic situation of the families living in Cyprus at the time, it makes things even easier to understand why the Arabs were so keen to get involved. It's important to remember that not all Arabs are the same. Not all of them bought girls in Cyprus. The Arabs who came to Cyprus and bought girls from here were usually middle or low-income families. These were mostly folks who were engaged in various forms of craft work. Mustafa Bitirim was keen to point out that not all Arabs were the same in the brochure he published, saying, "I've had the pleasure of meeting many wonderful Arab people, and I'm grateful to have crossed paths with some truly exceptional individuals." Mustafa Bitirim was keen to make it clear that not all Arabs were the same. 5. Let's talk about the sad situation in Palestine. When Israel took over in 1948, they forced all the people who lived there to leave. Turkish Cypriot girls, who had previously been sold to Arabs, were among those affected by this sad expulsion. Those who left Palestine found themselves in a bit of a pickle, having to settle in camps in Jordan. There are 13 lovely immigrant camps here. Many of these camps are in a pretty bad way, and the living conditions are pretty rough. These living spaces were originally set up as tent camps, but later transformed into simple, one-story houses. The streets are in a bit of a state, to be honest. The lovely folks at the United Nations are doing their best to help out by providing services to these camps, since they aren't served by the municipality. But sadly, they can't add to the buildings they've already built. If folks don't follow the rules, the UN kindly asks them to turn off their water and electricity. The good news is that the United Nations is there to provide all the services you need, especially when it comes to health. It's so sad. These services are almost non-existent, as the people living there say. It's so sad. People who were already struggling just couldn't cope with the situation and ended up resenting their fate. They just kept on going, but with a constant fear of what the future held for them. Neriman Kahit went to Jordan and found some Turkish Cypriot girls who were really struggling to survive in the camps there. She got in touch with some of them and helped them out as much as she could. After hearing these heartbreaking stories, she said the following: "I went, I saw, and I died." This statement really shows how tough their situation is. I'd like to share a few examples of Turkish Cypriot girls who have lived in these camps and been sold to distant lands. Their stories are so sad, but they're also inspiring. Let me tell you about Hatice Tevfik Ali. At just 16 years old, she set off for Palestine as a bride. Her husband found her through a broker. She was the youngest of 4 siblings, bless her heart. Her wedding was held at the broker's house in Nicosia. Neriman Kahit was living in a camp in Jordan when she met him. Can you imagine that? She's now 97 years old and still remembers what she went through all those years ago. It's so sad. She's never been able to go back to Cyprus since she got married. She still feels resentful towards her family, poor thing. It's so sad. No one from her family has ever gone to her and asked about her. He was really sad about this situation and said, "It's so sad that no one came to visit. They forgot about me, and neither my family, nor my relatives, nor Cyprus, nor Cypriots. Whoever sells you, sell you. Whoever buys you, buy you," he said with a sad smile, expressing his deep sadness and helplessness. Another one, Vedia Mustafa, was sold to Palestine in 1936 when she was only 14 years old. Vedia Mustafa, who went to Palestine, never forgot about her homeland. Vedia Mustafa's grandson, Dr. Ahmed, was really sad to see his grandmother so unhappy. So he went to Cyprus with his dad and found his grandmother's relatives. After all these years, Vedia and her family were finally reunited to reminisce together. However, as quickly as the joy came, the sadness set in. After 40 long years of not seeing her family, Vedia Mustafa was so overcome with emotion that she became speechless when she met them and hugged them again and again, unable to speak. Her siblings, who live in London, were so kind and welcoming. They really went above and beyond to help her. After 2 years of treatment, the doctors gave their final advice. There's no reason for him not to speak. He just doesn't want to. Let me tell you about Nekla Omer. She's a sweet girl who lives with her father in the village of Evretu in Paphos. Halil is a well-known and much-loved broker in Cyprus. He is aware of the situation of Nekla and her father. He tells her father the good news. His daughter will live in better conditions and be comfortable. At first, her father is a little reluctant to send his daughter to an unknown land. But Simsar Halil reassures him that the Arab groom candidate he has brought with him is a doctor. In a moment of desperation and poverty, she accepts this offer. However, Nekla's heart is set on a young man named Mustafa, with whom she lives in the same village. Despite this, she obeys her father and marries the Arab groom-to-be, and off she goes to Palestine. When Nekla arrived in Palestine, she was in for a real roller coaster of emotions. Oh, it was such a shame. The groom-to-be, who introduced himself as a doctor, turned out to be a greengrocer. As time went on, the Arab groom started to treat Nekla very badly and make her life a real misery. Poor Nekla. On top of all that, she was also suffering from family longing and homesickness. It was a truly insurmountable situation for her. As a result of this awful situation, poor Nekla found herself in a brothel. During the Second World War, a young man named Mustafa, whom Nekla had fallen head over heels for, came to Palestine with the British. He looked everywhere for Nekla but couldn't find her. Many years later, Nekla returned to Nicosia. Here she continued her life, working in a brothel, and sadly died in the swamp she had fallen into. Let me tell you about another wonderful person, Hussein Suleiman Vachide Hanım. She was the youngest of 5 siblings, and she lived with her family in Aitotoro in the south of Cyprus. Vasid was taken to Palestine by her aunt when she was just a tiny 3-year-old. When she was 15, her aunt married her off to a 30-year-old teacher named Muhammad Fatih. This marriage, which lasted for 20 years, was a really tough time for Ms. Vasid. Ms. Vasid summed up her marriage like this: "My aunt married me off to a Palestinian man who was a teacher, but not in the way you'd expect. He was more like Azrael, my Azrael." Mrs. Vasid, who went through a lot of suffering for 20 years, decided to end her marriage and start a new one. But sadly, her second husband also left her alone. Mrs. Vasid was in a really tough spot because her husband had left her. She even sold her clothes to make sure she had something to eat. The kind imam who lived nearby took pity on them and said, "I'll collect money for you and take your daughters back to your hometown." Mrs. Vasid, who returned to Cyprus with so much hope, was sadly disappointed by her relatives, who didn't even come to greet her. Poor Vasid from Cyprus. Her life was full of hope, longing, and disappointment. There are so many more stories to tell. Many of them have lived through some really tough times, feeling totally despairing and hopeless. And there were some who were lucky enough to live peaceful lives. Even in the most peaceful of circumstances, homesickness could still find a way to creep in. I'm happy to say that this issue of selling came to an end in 1948. Sadly, because Israel had taken over Palestine, the Arabs were no longer able to come to Cyprus. The same thing happened with buying too. Conclusion and evaluation. Cyprus is in a great spot, which is why it's been important to so many countries over the years. The first Arab relations took place in 649, during the reign of the 3rd Caliph of Islam, Uthman. Since that time, the Arabs have always kept up their connections with the island. The Ottoman Empire took over the island in 1571 and made it part of their territory. Since then, the lovely Turks were gradually settled on the island. The island was ruled with justice during the Ottoman rule, which was a great thing for the people who lived there at the time. In 1879, the British took Cyprus from the Ottoman Empire on a temporary basis. They promised to stand against the Russians in exchange for this. From this date onwards, the Turkish people were sadly pushed to the second plan on the island. In 1914, Britain made the sad announcement that it would be annexing Cyprus. It's so sad. Since the British took control of the island, Turks have remained under pressure. With the signing of the Lausanne Treaty, the Turkish people living on the island started to migrate to Anatolia. Sadly, as a result of these migrations, the population of the island decreased. But the good news is that the Turks started to live under British protection. The lovely people who were living in such difficult circumstances looked for ways to make their lives better. And then, to make matters worse, there was a drought. It was just too much to bear. Some unscrupulous types saw that the people were in a desperate situation and started to engage in brokerage activities in Cyprus, targeting young girls. Some Arabs who came to the island bought girls from desperate families through these brokers. They knew that they could buy girls cheaper in their own countries, which was a shame. The poor families, in their desperation, sold their daughters to the Arabs in the hope that they would be safe and well looked after. These poor girls were sent to countries where they didn't even speak the language. Sadly, most of them ended up as second or third wives to the men they married. It was really tough for them in the places they ended up because they didn't speak the language, and their Arab families were pretty rough on them because they couldn't express themselves. Some of them were lucky enough to live comfortably, but they still suffered from terrible homesickness. In 1948, when Israel occupied Palestine, the situation became more dire. These people, who had to leave Palestine, lived in camps in other countries in a miserable situation. Turkish Cypriot girls, who were sold to Arabs, continued their lives longing for their families and their homeland. Many of them lived resentful and reproachful to their families. In 1948, with the occupation of Palestine, Arabs could not come to buy girls from Cyprus. This purchase issue was resolved on its own,